The tale of Lo Hsing Han is not merely a story of crime, it is a dark, intricate tapestry woven into the very fabric of Southeast Asian history, a saga where geopolitics, insurgency, and pure, unadulterated greed colluded to birth an empire of addiction. To understand the man who would become the godfather of heroin, one must first journey into the rugged, mist-shrouded highlands of the Golden Triangle, a region encompassing parts of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. This is a land of formidable mountains, dense jungles, and deep river valleys, a terrain so remote and inaccessible that for centuries it remained beyond the effective control of any central government. It is a place where borders are theoretical lines on a map, where ethnic identities run deeper than national allegiance, and where the law is often what a man with the most guns and the fiercest fighters says it is. Into this world, Lo Hsing Han was born on July 5, 1935, in the Shan State of British Burma. His was an ethnic Shan family, part of a proud and often restive majority in their own state, but a minority in the broader Burmese tapestry. The world into which he arrived was one in tumult. British colonial rule was the overarching reality, but its grip was uneven. Especially in these peripheral highlands, the Second World War would soon sweep through, with the Japanese invasion and the brutal fighting that followed further destabilizing the region and introducing a generation to violence, displacement, and the mechanics of survival in a land with no clear masters. Young Lo Hsing Han's formal education was negligible, a common fate for boys in his circumstances. Instead, his classroom was the chaotic post-war landscape. As Burma gained independence in 1948, it did not find peace, but rather plunged headlong into a multifaceted civil war. The central government in Rangoon, dominated by the Burman ethnic majority, sought to consolidate control, but it was immediately challenged by a plethora of ethnic armed groups, communist insurgents, and private militias, all vying for territory, autonomy, or power. The Shan State became a central battleground in this complex conflict. It was in this crucible of chaos that Lo Hsing Han's character was forged. He learned early that, in the absence of a strong state, power flowed from the barrel of a gun and loyalty was a commodity to be bought, sold, or enforced. He joined one of the many Shan resistance forces, but his ambition quickly outstripped the role of a mere foot soldier. He was not a fiery ideologue fighting for Shan independence in the pure sense. He was a pragmatic opportunist who saw in the endless conflict not a tragedy, but a marketplace. The various armies, whether ethnic or communist, needed funds to buy weapons, feed troops, and sustain their struggles. Opium, cultivated for generations by the hill tribes of the region as a medicinal cash crop, presented the perfect solution. It was durable, high in value relative to its weight, and had a ready, insatiable international market. Lo Hsing Han possessed a keen, ruthless mind for logistics and organization. He began to involve himself deeply in the opium trade, not just as a transporter or a protector, but as a strategist. He understood that to build a stable business in an unstable land, he needed his own force. Thus began his transformation from insurgent to warlord. He started consolidating his own faction, attracting fighters with promises of wealth and power, eliminate rivals through treachery or brute force, and negotiating shifting alliances with larger armed groups. His power base grew in the lawless tracts near the Thai border, a region ideal for the movement of illicit goods. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, while the world focused on the Cold War and Vietnam, Lo Hsing Han was quietly building the foundations of a narcotic empire. He established a network of mule trains, armed convoys, and secret jungle routes to move raw opium from the fields of Shan State to refineries often hidden in remote border areas. These refineries, primitive at first, would transform the raw sap of the poppy into smokable opium and, increasingly, into the far more potent and profitable product morphine base, and eventually heroin. His operation was a military-commercial hybrid. His men were both soldiers and smugglers. His camps both barracks and trading posts. He dealt with everyone, Shan nationalists, Kuomintang remnants who had fled China and settled in the region, Thai border police, corrupt officials from Rangoon, and other warlords. In this ecosystem, Lo Hsing Han thrived. He was not the only player, but he was among the most cunning and ambitious. He earned a reputation for being fiercely intelligent, utterly ruthless, and a master of the double cross. His word was only good as long as it served his interest, and his alliances shifted with the wind, always calculated to maximize his profit and expand his territory. He became a kingmaker in the complex politics of the Shan rebellion, financing certain factions to destabilize others, ensuring that no single group grew strong enough to challenge his paramountcy over the trade. The Burmese government, struggling to exert authority, initially saw men like Lo Hsing Han as a nuisance, but also, paradoxically, as potential pawns. This tense, symbiotic relationship between the state and the narcotics warlord would become a defining feature of his career. A dance of betrayal and accommodation that would last for decades. This was the first phase of his rise, the emergence of the warlord from the fog of war, a man who looked at a map of conflict and saw not borders to defend, but routes to control, not ideologies to follow, but profits to be made from the very anarchy that surrounded him. His name began to whisper through intelligence reports in Bangkok, Rangoon, and eventually Washington. But he was still a shadowy figure, a local problem in a remote corner of the world. That was about to change dramatically, as the demand for his product was set to explode, and Lo Hsing Han stood perfectly positioned to meet it, catapulting him from a regional warlord to a figure of global criminal infamy. The catalyst that transformed Lo Hsing Han from a regionally significant opium trader into a global narcotics powerhouse was an event unfolding thousands of miles away, the Vietnam War. As American involvement in Southeast Asia deepened throughout the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops poured into the region, bringing with them not only military might, but also social upheaval and a demand for escapism. The stressful, terrifying, and often monotonous reality of war created a fertile ground for drug use among soldiers. While marijuana was prevalent, a more potent and convenient form of relief was sought. Heroin, particularly the highly pure, smokable form known as number 4 heroin, began to fill this void. It was this sudden, massive, and financially flush market that Lo Hsing Han and his counterpart in the Golden Triangle were poised to supply with devastating efficiency. His operations evolved rapidly to meet this new demand. The primitive jungle refineries were upgraded, often with the help of chemists from Hong Kong or Bangkok, to produce heroin of unprecedented purity. Lo Hsing Han's strategic genius lay in his vertical integration of the entire narcotic supply chain. He no longer just taxed farmers or protected caravans. He now controlled, either directly or through coercive alliances, every critical step. From the poppy fields where hill tribe farmers, often indebted or coerced, cultivated the crops under the watchful eyes of his armed men, to the collection networks that gathered the raw opium, to the mobile laboratories hidden in the jungle that processed it into heroin, and finally to the sophisticated smuggling routes that delivered the product to its consumers. One of his most infamous creations was the heroin highway, a complex network of trails, river roads, and covert roads that moved product from the Shan State through northern Thailand to Bangkok. Bangkok, the bustling, cosmopolitan capital of Thailand, became the primary export hub. From there, heroin was concealed in everything from luggage of unsuspecting tourists and diplomatic pouches to statues of Buddha and shipments of teakwood destined for the streets of Saigon, where it was sold to America. And beyond to the burgeoning markets in North America and Europe. Lo Hsing Han's organization worked with a chilling corporate efficiency. He employed accountants, chemists, and logistics experts. He had his own intelligence network to monitor rival groups and law enforcement movements. He maintained a private army, which by the early 1970s was estimated to number in the thousands, equipped with modern weapons often purchased from the black markets of Southeast Asia, or even sourced from corrupt elements within national militaries. This army was not just for defense. It was an instrument of terror used to enforce discipline, punish PayPal, and intimidate entire villages into compliance. His rule over his domain was absolute. He established a virtual state within a state, with its own laws, its own economy, based on narcotics, and its own foreign policy of bribery and alliance. He became incredibly wealthy, but he reinvested his profits back into his empire, buying more weapons, bribing more officials, and financing political fronts. One such front was the Shan State army, an ethnic resistance force with which he had a deeply cynical relationship. Lo Hsing Han provided it with funds and weapons, not out of patriotism for the Shan cause, but because, supporting an insurgency again, the central Burmese government kept the region unstable and lawless, which was the perfect environment for his business to thrive. He played all sides against the middle, sometimes negotiating ceasefire deals with the government, while simultaneously undermining them. His influence extended into Thailand, where he cultivated relationships with high-ranking figures in the military and border police, ensuring his convoys could pass unmolested. This period marked the zenith of his power. He was no longer just a smuggler, he was Khun Sa's great rival, though often his collaborator. In a duopoly that controlled the world's heroin supply, the term warlord fit him perfectly, a feudal baron of the drug trade, commanding loyalty through fear and patronage, ruling a fiefdom defined by addiction and violence. Reports from the era describe him not as a flamboyant gangster, but as a quiet, calculating, and fiercely disciplined man. He was known to be abstemious, not a user of the product that made him rich, and he ruled his organization with an iron fist. Disloyalty or failure was met with swift and brutal execution. This ruthlessness, combined with his strategic acumen, made him seemingly untouchable. The governments of Burma and Thailand appeared powerless to stop him. His domain was too remote, his army too strong, and his web of corruption too extensive. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, established in 1973, began to flag him as a prime target. But apprehending him on his home turf was a near impossible task. He was a ghost in the jungle, protected by terrain, guns, and graft. He embodied the term untouchable. Yet, in his towering ambition and the very nature of his business lay the seeds of his downfall. The sheer scale of his operation, which had brought him such power, also made him a threat to the very governments he had corrupted and manipulated. The flow of heroin to American soldiers in Vietnam became a national scandal in the U.S., creating immense political pressure to act. Furthermore, his manipulations of Burmese politics would eventually provoke a response from a military junta that was itself learning to use the drug trade as a tool of statecraft, and would not tolerate a rival power center growing too independent. The dance with the Burmese state was about to take a violent turn, setting the stage for betrayal, imprisonment, and an unexpected rebirth that would shock the world and redefine the meaning of criminal impunity. The turning point in Lo Hsing Han's story, the moment his seemingly unassailable fortress of power began to show cracks, originating not from an external invasion but from a calculated betrayal within the intricate web of his own alliances with the Burmese state. For years, he had navigated the turbulent waters of Burmese politics by playing the central government in Rangoon against the various ethnic insurgencies, including the Shan nationalists he nominally supported. He provided the ruling military, known as the Revolutionary Council under General Ne Win, with valuable intelligence on communist and ethnic rebel movements. In return, they often turned a blind eye to his narcotics operations, viewing him as a useful, if distasteful, tool in their counterinsurgency efforts, a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This fragile, mutually exploitative relationship, however, was destined to collapse under the weight of Lo Hsing Han's growing ambition and the government's increasing unease with his autonomous power. The catalyst was Lo Hsing Han's audacious move in 1973 to form a new political military entity called the Shan United Army, SUA. While presented as a unified front for Shan resistance, its true purpose was far more pragmatic: to consolidate his control over the entire Golden Triangle heroin trade by eliminating rivals and streamlining his smuggling operations under a single, powerful military banner. The SUA was, in essence, the corporate branding of his narcotics empire, private army dedicated not to a national cause but to market dominance. This move alarmed both his rivals, like the rising Khun Sa, and more importantly, the Burmese government. Ne Win's regime was attempting to impose a stricter, socialist-oriented control over the fractious country, and the sight of a drug lord raising a large, well-armed private army and declaring what amounted to a sovereign territory within Shan State was an intolerable challenge to their authority. It signaled a shift from a useful proxy to a potential rival state. The Burmese military decided the time had come to clip his wings. They orchestrated a plan that relied on deception and Lo Hsing Han's own sense of security within his network of corrupt connection. In late 1973, he was invited to the town of Taungyi, the capital of Shan State, for what was presented as high-level peace talks with Burmese military intelligence officials. The lure was a potential ceasefire agreement, an official recognition, a chance to legitimize his power, seeing an opportunity to formalize his status, and perhaps gain a political victory. Lo Hsing Han, against the advice of some of his more cautious lieutenants, agreed to attend. It was a fatal miscalculation. On arrival, he was not greeted as a negotiating partner, but immediately arrested by Burmese authorities. The betrayal was complete. The very government officials he had bribed and collaborated with now had him in chains. The news sent shockwaves through the underworld and intelligence communities. The untouchable warlord had been touched. He was charged with treason and drug trafficking, and after a highly publicized trial, he was sentenced to death. For a time, Lo Hsing Han languished in insane prison, one of Burma's most notorious penitentiaries, awaiting execution. His vast empire, however, did not crumble immediately. It was managed by his family and top lieutenants, but internal strife and attacks from rivals like Kunsa, who saw an opportunity to capture his market share, weakened its structure. The Burmese government, having removed the king, now sought to control the kingdom. They launched military campaigns against the Sua, fragmenting it further. Yet, even from his death row cell, Lo Hsing Han's story was far from over. He became a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. His knowledge of the region's insurgent networks and smuggling routes was considered invaluable. His connections in Thailand and his understanding of the financial architecture of the heroin trade were assets that various parties, including the Burmese state itself, were reluctant to see extinguished. The death sentence hung over him but was never carried out. Years passed. The geopolitical landscape shifted. In 1980, in a move that stunned observers, the Burmese government, under continued pressure from insurgencies and seeking new tools for control, commuted Lo Hsing Han's death sentence to life imprisonment. This was the first hint of a possible resurrection. Then, in a twist that defied belief, he was released from prison in 1981. After serving only a fraction of his life term. The official reason was a general amnesty, but the unofficial truth was a coldly pragmatic deal. The Burmese junta, now under the even more repressive rule of General Nguyen, realized it could not defeat all the ethnic insurgencies militarily. It adopted a new strategy, ceasefire capitalism. The plan was to co-opt powerful armed groups, especially those involved in the drug trade, by offering them legal ceasefire agreements, autonomy in their areas, and business opportunities often in natural resources like timber, gems, and of course, a blind eye to continued narcotics production in exchange for ending their rebellion and even fighting against other insurgent groups that refused to deal. Lo Hsing Han, the original architect of using chaos for profit, was the perfect candidate for this new policy. His release was conditional. He was to use his remaining influence to help broker ceasefires, to act as an intermediary between the government and other armed factions, and to bring a measure of stability of the government's kind to the Shan State. In essence, they were offering him a chance to rebuild his empire, but this time as a partner of the state, a sanctioned oligarch. He emerged from prison not as a broken man, but as a reinvented one. The Godfather of Heroin was back, but now he wore a new mask, that of a legitimate businessman and a peace broker. This marked the beginning of the most audacious and controversial chapter of his life, where the lines between criminal warlord, government agent, and corporate tycoon would blur into obscurity, challenging the very definitions of justice and power in Myanmar. Emerging from the shadow of the executioner's block and the grim confines of insane prison, Lo Hsing Han did not return to the jungle as a fugitive warlord. He re-entered Burmese society as a man transformed by a sinister pact with the very state that had once condemned him to death. This period, from the early 1980s onward, represents the most complex and morally ambiguous phase of his life. where he masterfully navigated the junta's policy of ceasefire capitalism to rebuild an empire far more diversified, politically connected, and brazenly public than his previous heroin-centric domain. His freedom was a calculated investment by the ruling State Law and Order Restoration Council, SLORC, which saw in him a uniquely potent instrument. They tasked him with a critical mission to use his unparalleled influence, his feared reputation, and his intimate understanding of the rebel landscape to persuade or compel other ethnic armed groups, particularly in the Shan State, to lay down their arms and accept ceasefire agreements with the government. In this role, Lo Hsing Han became the junta's ultimate fixer. A shadow diplomat of insurgency, he traveled to remote rebel camps, not with an army to attack, but with offers from Rangoon. His message was potent and pragmatic. You cannot win. Look at me. I fought them, and they put me on death row. Now I work with them, and I am free, rich, and powerful. You can have the same. His credibility was undeniable. Who better to broker deals with drug-funded armies than the Godfather of Heroin himself? He was spectacularly successful. He played a key role in convincing several major factions to agree to ceasefires, which allowed the Burmese military to redirect its forces against groups that remained intractable, like the Karen National Union. In return for these services, the junta granted him something priceless: legitimacy. He was allowed to form ostensibly legitimate business conglomerates. He established Asia World Company Limited, which would become one of the largest and most influential conglomerates in Myanmar. Asia World started with traditional narcotics-adjacent businesses like trading, transport, and logistics sectors where his existing expertise and networks were paramount, but it rapidly expanded into the very heart of the legal economy. The company secured lucrative government contracts for mega projects that were cornerstones of the junta's plans for development and control. Asia World built highways, bridges, dams, and ports. It became deeply involved in the extraction of Myanmar's natural resources, including logging, mining, and layer, oil, and gas. The Rangoon, Yangon International Airport's modernization and the city's deep sea port projects were developed by Asia World. He even ventured into tourism, banking, and real estate. This breathtaking transformation from jungle drug lord to construction magnate and infrastructure tycoon was made possible by two interconnected factors: the immense capital accumulated from decades of heroin trafficking, which was now laundered through these massive projects, and his seamless integration into the highest echelons of the military regime. His business partner in Asia World was his son, Stephen Law, who was educated overseas and brought a veneer of international business savvy to the operation. Together they built a corporate behemoth. Lo Hsing Han himself cultivated the image of a benevolent, if reclusive, business leader. He donated to Buddhist temples, a crucial act for gaining social standing in Myanmar, and engaged in public philanthropy. He built schools and clinics in areas under his influence. To the outside world, and to many in Myanmar's urban centers, he was now Lo Hsing Han, the honorific, denoting respect to successful, if shadowy, billionaire who had left his past behind. But this narrative of redemption was a carefully constructed illusion. Investigative journalists, NGOs, and foreign governments maintained that Asia World was a masterpiece of money laundering and that Lo Hsing Han never truly abandoned the narcotics trade. Instead, he allegedly oversaw a strategic shift. While he may have reduced his direct involvement in day-to-day heroin operations, evidence suggested he remained the paramount patron and protector of the trade in the Shan State. His ceasefire deals often included clauses that allowed former rebel armies turned government militias to retain control of their territories and their economic activities, which invariably included opium cultivation and heroin refining. He provided the political protection from Rangoon, and in return, these groups paid tribute or allowed his companies to dominate the legitimate business in their region. His transportation network, originally built for smuggling heroin, now moved legal goods, but the infrastructure and contacts remained perfectly suited for dual use. He had effectively institutionalized the drug trade, embedding it within the state-sanctioned economy. His power became systemic. He was no longer an outsider challenging the state. He was a pillar of its corrupt ecosystem. This new status provided him with a level of impunity that even his jungle fortress had not. He was frequently seen in Yangon at high-level government functions, rubbing shoulders with generals and ministers, foreign diplomats and aid agencies desperate to operate in Myanmar. Sometimes found they had to engage with Asia World due to its stranglehold on logistics and construction. The United States government watched this metamorphosis with a combination of fury and frustration. In 1996, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, took the extraordinary step of designating Lo Hsing Han as a specially designated narcotics trafficker under the Kingpin Act, freezing any assets he might have in the U.S., and prohibiting Americans from doing business with him. The announcement explicitly stated that his legitimate businesses were fronts for narcotics money laundering. This designation was a stark, official contradiction to the whitewashed image he projected within Myanmar. Yet, within the borders of his own country, the designation meant little. Protected by the junta, Lo Hsing Han was untouchable. He lived in a luxurious compound in Yangon, traveling in motorcades with armed guards. His life was a living testament to the ultimate criminal success story. Not just evading justice, but being embraced by power, transforming blood money into corporate respectability, and ensuring his legacy would be carved not in the ephemeral powder of heroin, but in the concrete and steel of a nation's infrastructure. He had achieved the dream of every kingpin, to become part of the establishment. But this establishment was one of the world's most oppressive regimes, and his story, therefore, became inextricably linked with the tragedy of modern Myanmar, a nation where crime and statecraft fused, where peace was bought with the profits of addiction, and where a warlord's journey from death row to the boardroom revealed the rotten foundations of a military dictatorship. The final act of Lo Hsing Han's life was a masterclass in the consolidation of power through the strategic fusion of crime, commerce, and political patronage, all conducted under the protective shield of the Burmese military junta. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, his position seemed more unassailable than ever before. Asia World Company Limited grew from strength to strength, becoming an indispensable part of Myanmar's crippled economy, and the junta's ambitious, if often exploitative, development plan. The company's portfolio expanded into sectors that were critical to the state's interests. It partnered with international firms, particularly from China and Singapore, to develop massive infrastructure projects. One of the most prominent was the Shui gas project, a multi-billion-dollar endeavor to extract natural gas from offshore fields in the Bay of Bengal and transport it via a pipeline across Myanmar to China. Asia World was heavily involved in the construction of the onshore infrastructure for this pipeline, a project notorious for human rights abuses, land confiscations, and environmental damage along its route. This involvement was deeply symbolic. Lo Hsing Han, the former heroin trafficker, was now a key facilitator in a strategic energy deal that bankrolled the very generals who protected him and strengthened the economic grip of China, a major geopolitical patron of the junta. His business empire effectively became a financial lifeline for the regime, providing not only construction services but also a vital channel for laundering the state's own illicit revenues from resources like gems, timber, and indirectly drugs. The relationship was perfectly symbiotic. The generals provided Lo Hsing Han with legal impunity, lucrative contracts, and a veneer of respectability. In return, he provided them with a controlled interface with the global economy, a means to develop infrastructure without relying solely on foreign entities they couldn't control, and a powerful ally in managing the restive border region. His role as a ceasefire broker evolved into that of a regional governor in all but name. In areas where his influence was paramount, he maintained a parallel administration. His private security forces, now often rebranded as company security or merged with government-backed militia structures, kept order. He settled local disputes, funded community projects, and his word was often law. This feudal governance, paid for by a blend of narcotics profits and state contracts, create pockets of relative stability. But it was a stability built on fear and corruption, and one that perpetuated the cycle of addiction, poverty for the local population, who remained trapped in an economy where opium was often the only viable cash crop. Internationally, however, the pressure on his legacy continued to mount. The U.S. designation as a narcotics kingpin was not an isolated act. He was featured prominently in global reports on drug trafficking by the United Nations and other agencies. Investigative pieces by outlets like The New Yorker and the BBC meticulously detailed the connection between Asia World's gleaming construction sites and the heroin labs of the Shan State. His son and business heir, Stephen Law, also found himself under scrutiny and sanctions from Western governments. Yet, within Myanmar's tightly controlled media environment, such criticism was absent. State newspapers occasionally featured him as a patriotic businessman contributing to national development. This stark dichotomy between his international notoriety and his domestic rehabilitation was a defining feature of his later years. He became a ghost haunting the international financial system, a sanctioned entity that major global banks had to avoid, while operating with complete freedom at home. His health began to decline in his later years, and he became increasingly reclusive, managing his empire from his fortified compound in Yangon. The political landscape around him also started to shift in subtle ways. In 2011, a nominally civilian government, led by President Thein Sein, but still dominated by the military, began a series of political and economic reforms aimed at ending Myanmar's international isolation. This period of opening raised questions about the future of the old, sanctioned oligarchs like Lo Hsing Han. Would a reforming Myanmar finally hold its most infamous drug lord to account? The answer, it seemed, was no. The reforms did not dismantle the underlying power structures, they merely repackaged them. The military's economic interests, deeply intertwined with companies like Asia World, remained sacrosanct. Lo Hsing Han's empire was so deeply embedded in the nation's economic and political fabric that uprooting it would have threatened the stability of the entire elite. He died on July 6, 2013, one day after his 78th birthday, in Yangon. His death was marked by a funeral that laid bare the contradictions of his life. It was a grand, traditional Buddhist ceremony, attended by hundreds of monks who chanted prayers for his salvation. But the congregation also included high-ranking government officials, military officers, and business tycoons, the very establishment that had both condemned and sanctified him. The state media announced his passing with respectful obituaries, acknowledging his contributions to national development and his role in peacemaking, while conspicuously omitting his title as the Godfather of Heroin. The international media, however, told the other half of the story, recapping his life as a journey from jungle warlord to sanctioned kingpin, a man who had orchestrated the flow of poison to the world while building a monument to himself in the form of a corporate conglomerate. His legacy did not die with him. Asia World continues to be one of the most powerful conglomerates in Myanmar, now run by his son, Stephen Law. It remains at the heart of the country's economy, involved in everything from ports and special economic zones to urban development. The U.S. sanctions remain in place on the company and the Law family, a lasting testament to its origins. Lo Hsing Han's life story thus stands as the ultimate case study in criminal evolution and state capture. He demonstrated that in a weak or corrupt state, a sufficiently ruthless and intelligent criminal can do more than just evade the law. He can become the law, can partner with the state, and can transform illicit wealth into lasting, institutionalized power that outlives him. His was not a story of downfall in the traditional sense, but of a terrifyingly successful metamorphosis, leaving behind a nation still grappling with the poisoned fruits of his empire, an empire built on heroin and solidified in concrete. Truly comprehend the monumental scale of Lo Hsing Han's criminal enterprise and its devastating global impact, one must venture beyond the biography of the man and delve into the intricate, ruthless machinery of the heroin empire he helped pioneer. This was not a disorganized gang of smugglers, but a sophisticated, vertically integrated multinational corporation whose product was addiction and whose bottom line was measured in human suffering. At the base of this pyramid were the impoverished hill tribe farmer of the Shan State, the Kachin, and other ethnic minorities. For generations, they had cultivated opium poppies as a cash crop, the only reliable means of survival in the harsh, mountainous terrain where rice and other legal crops yielded little profit. Lo Hsing Han's organization, and others like it, did not create the agricultural reality, but expertly exploited and weaponized it. His agents, often armed, would advance credit or essential goods to these farmers at the beginning of the planting season, indebting them to the syndicate. When harvest time came, the farmers were compelled to sell their raw opium at prices set by the organization, ensuring a cheap and steady supply. Resistance or attempts to sell to rival groups could result in violence, the destruction of crops, or worse. This system created a form of economic serfdom, binding entire communities to the narcotics trade. The raw opium, a thick, dark paste, was then collected at central locations. From there, it entered a logistical network of breathtaking efficiency. Caravans of mules, capable of navigating narrow jungle trails impassable to vehicles, would carry the opium to hidden jungle laboratories. These labs, often nothing more than bamboo huts equipped with steel drums, charcoal fire, and precursor chemicals like acetic anhydride, were where the transformation occurred. Skilled chemists, sometimes hired from abroad, would cook the opium into morphine base and then refine it into heroin. Lo Hsing Han was instrumental in pushing for higher quality and purity to meet the demands of the American market. The resulting heroin, often over 90% pure, was a far cry from the diluted street product. This was China White, a potent and deadly form of the drug. The refined heroin was then packaged for its long journey. The heroin highway was the syndicate's crowning logistical achievement. It was a constantly evolving network of routes adapting to law enforcement pressures. One major path led south from the Shan State into Thailand's northern provinces like Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai. Here, corruption was the essential lubricant. Thai border police, army units, and local officials were systematically bribed, creating safe corridors for the shipments. The heroin would be hidden in trucks carrying legitimate cargo like fruits, vegetables, or timber. Sometimes it was carried by human mules on commercial buses or trains. The key transit point was Bangkok. In the bustling markets, ports, and airports of the Thai capital, the heroin was expertly repackaged for international export. It was concealed in hollowed-out furniture, secreted within exported handicrafts, packed into condoms and swallowed by couriers, or stashed in the false bottoms of shipping containers. The destinations were manifold. A significant portion went to feed the habit of American soldiers in Vietnam, a trade so brazen it operated in the open in Saigon's back alleys. But as the Vietnam War ended, the syndicate, with Lo Hsing Han at its helm, pivoted effortlessly to new markets. Vast quantities began flooding into Europe, Australia, and across the United States. The organization established connections with Chinese triads, Italian mafia groups, and American street gangs to handle distribution. The financial proceeds were astronomical. At its peak in the 1970s and 80s, the Golden Triangle, dominated by Lo Hsing Han and his rival Kun Sa, supplied an estimated 60 to 70% of the world's heroin. The revenue generated was in the hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars annually. Managing this cash flow required its own financial architecture. Profits were laundered through a web of front companies in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Thailand. They were invested in real estate, hotels, casinos, and later, through Asia World, in the legitimate infrastructure of Myanmar itself. The organization also plowed money back into its own security and expansion. Lo Hsing Han's private army, the Shan United Army, was a formidable military force. It was equipped with modern automatic rifles, mortars, anti-aircraft guns, and even reportedly surface-to-air missiles. It ran training camps, had its own communications network, and could engage in sustained battles with the Burmese military or rival warlords. This military might was not just for defense. It was used to conquer and hold territory, to protect laboratories and smuggling routes, and to intimidate and control the local population. The human cost of this empire is incalculable. It directly fueled addiction epidemics across the globe, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths from overdoses, drug-related violence, and diseases like HIV/AIDS spread through shared needles. It corrupted governments, eroded the rule of law in Thailand and Burma, and perpetuated a cycle of violence and poverty in the Shan State that persists to this day. The farmers remained poor, the users died, the couriers faced imprisonment or death, while the kingpins like Lo Hsing Han amassed fortunes and power. This was the cold, brutal calculus of his business. He was not a romantic outlaw, but the CEO of a corporation that dealt in death. His His operational genius lay in his understanding of systems of supply chains, of corruption, of geopolitical tension. He saw the jungles of the Golden Triangle not as a barrier, but as a strategic asset. He saw the civil war in Burma not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. He saw the addicted soldiers of Vietnam not as victims, but as a target market. This macro-level view, combined with a micromanager's attention to the details of bribes, chemical processes, and caravan schedules, is what made him not just a successful criminal, but an architect of a global scourge. His empire was a dark mirror of globalization, proving that in the shadow economy, supply and demand operate with a chilling efficiency that can outpace and outmaneuver the efforts of nations, at least for a time. The story of Lo Hsing Han is, therefore, also the story of the heroine itself, from the sun-drenched poppy fields of Shan State to the grim backstreets of cities worldwide, a journey of misery meticulously engineered for profit by a man who, from his remote jungle headquarters, touched and destroyed lives on every continent. The intricate dance between Lo Hsing Han and the various governments that sought to control him or were corrupted by him forms a central, grim theme in his saga, revealing a world where the lines between crime fighter and criminal accomplice were not just blurred, but often deliberately erased. This relationship was most complex and consequential with the Burmese state itself, a relationship that evolved from hostile confrontation to covert collaboration and finally to a full-blown partnership. In the early days of his rise, the Burmese central government, struggling with multiple insurgencies, viewed warlords like Lo as obstacles to national unity. Yet, they also represented a form of localized control in regions where Rangoon's authority was merely theoretical. Initial military campaigns against him were often half-hearted, undermined by the difficult terrain, lack of resources, and the sheer strength of his forces. More importantly, elements within the military and intelligence apparatus saw utility in him. He was a rich source of intelligence on communist and other ethnic rebel movements. This led to the first tentative alliances and unspoken agreements where Lo's convoys might be left alone if his men provided information or even assisted in operations against common enemies. This pragmatism morphed into something darker following his 1973 arrest. His capture was a decisive victory for state authority, but his death sentence became a bargaining chip of immense value. During his years in prison, he was not just a condemned man. He was a reservoir of knowledge. His understanding of the labyrinthine rebel networks, his contacts in Thailand and beyond, and the very structure of his empire were assets the state could not afford to waste. His release in 1981 was the clearest admission of this calculation. The junta under Ne Win was not offering forgiveness. It was recruiting a senior executive. They needed a man of his particular skills to manage the frontier. His new mandate was to pacify the borderlands not through outright military victory, which had proven elusive and expensive, but through a strategy of co-option, transforming rebel leaders into business partners under the state's umbrella. In this, Lo Hsing Han was the perfect middleman. He spoke the language of the insurgents, understood their motivations of profit and power, and could offer them a deal they could trust because it came from a peer, not a general in a distant capital. His success in brokering ceasefires was a masterstroke for the junta, allowing them to divide the opposition and concentrate their forces. In return, the state granted him a monopoly on legitimacy. His business, Asia World, became a sanctioned channel for laundering not just his own narcotic wealth, but also for funneling state capital into projects that enriched the ruling generals. The company's dominance in infrastructure was no accident. It was a reward. Building highways and ports served the dual purpose of developing the economy and the military's ability to project power, while creating legal avenues for immense sums of dirty money to be cleansed through concrete and steel. This symbiosis reached its peak in the 1990s and 2000s. Lo Hsing Han was no longer a mere trafficker. He was a key component of the military's political economy, a cornerstone in the system of crony capitalism that defined Myanmar. His relationship with the Thai state was equally transactional, but more purely mercenary. For decades, elements of the Thai military, police, and political elite were on his payroll. The flow of heroin from Burma into Thailand and out to the world required this protection. Senior Thai officials, particularly in the border provinces, benefited enormously. In some cases, Thai army units were directly involved in providing security for heroin refineries or storage facilities on Thai soil, treating the drug trade as a lucrative sideline to their official duties. This corruption was so systemic that it periodically sparked internal purges and scandals within Thailand, but the sheer profitability of the trade ensured it was never fully eradicated. Lo Hsing Han's networks were resilient, capable of shifting routes and partners when necessary. When one general was transferred, another would be bribed. This relationship ensured the heroin highway remained open for business for decades, making a mockery of Thailand's official anti-drug policies. The relationship with the United States was one of pure, unadulterated hostility. But even here, there were frustrating complexities for American agents. The DEA and other U.S. agencies identified Lo Hsing Han as a top-tier target as early as the 1970s. They amassed intelligence, tracked his operations, and lobbied for action. Yet, they were perpetually hamstrung by geopolitics and the realities of sovereignty. They could not conduct a military raid on Burmese soil. Their efforts to have him extradited were futile, as he was either in the jungle, beyond government control, or later, protected by the government itself. The U.S. had to rely on proxy actions, such as pressuring Thailand to act, which was often ineffective due to the corruption mentioned. The 1996 specially designated narcotics trafficker designation was a powerful tool of financial warfare, but its impact was limited outside the U.S. financial system. It branded him an international pariah, but did little to hinder his operations within Asia, where his business flourished. This disconnect highlighted a central truth. Lo Hsing Han's power was rooted in a specific, localized context where Western legal and financial pressures had limited reach. He was a creature of the Southeast Asian borderlands where state authority was negotiable and loyalty was a commodity. He exploited the fissures between nations, the greed within bureaucracies, and the chaos of civil war to build a realm where he was the ultimate authority. His story is thus a profound lesson in the limits of international justice when confronting a criminal who successfully embeds himself within the power structures of a sovereign state, especially one as opaque and repressive as Myanmar's junta. He demonstrated that the most dangerous criminals are not those who defy the state, but those who learn to merge with it, to become so useful to the powers that be that their crimes are overlooked, their wealth sanctified, and their legacy rewritten from that of a gangster to that of a patriot. In the end, the governments he dealt with were not monolithic entities fighting a clear battle against evil. They were collections of individuals, many of whom saw in Lo Hsing Han not a monster to be slain, but an opportunity to be seized. While Lo Hsing Han's name is often uttered in the same breath as the Golden Triangle's heroin trade, his story cannot be fully told without examining the dark constellation of rivals, allies, and victims that populated his world, a gallery of characters who shaped his path and were shaped by him in turn. Foremost among these was his great rival, Kunsa, born Chang Chi-fu. Their parallel lives created a duopoly that dominated the global heroin market for decades, where Lo Hsing Han was often portrayed as the calculating, politically minded strategist. Kunsa cultivated the image of the flamboyant, romantic rebel, openly declaring himself the king of the Golden Triangle, and even issued bonds for a proposed Shan independent state backed by opium revenues. Their relationship was a volatile mix of violent competition and uneasy cooperation. They fought brutal wars for control of territory and smuggling routes, with battles sometimes involving hundreds of fighters. Yet, they also collaborated when it served their interests, forming cartel-like agreements to stabilize prices or to present a unified front against government offensives. This rivalry pushed both to innovate and expand, driving the exponential growth of the region's heroin output. Lo Hsing Han's arrest in 1973 was a golden opportunity for Kunsa, who moved aggressively to absorb his rival's networks and territory, temporarily becoming the undisputed top trafficker. However, Lo's eventual return and transformation into a state-sanctioned power broker altered the dynamic, with Kunsa continuing an armed rebellion until his own ceasefire in 1996. Their intertwined fates show how the narcotics economy created its own ecosystem of warlords, each mirroring and challenging the other. Beyond Kunsa, Lo Hsing Han navigated a complex web of ethnic armed groups. He had a particularly cynical relationship, the cause of Shan nationalism. He financed and armed various Shan militias, not out of patriotism, but because a perpetually rebellious Shan State was a perfect environment for his business. He used these groups as proxies, destabilizing the central government and keeping the region lawless. When he brokered ceasefires for the junta later in life, he was often persuading the very groups he had once funded to lay down their arms, a testament to his role as a manipulator of conflict rather than a believer in any cause. Other key players were the remnants of the Chinese nationalist Kuomintang or KMT forces that had fled to the Golden Triangle after the communist victory in China in 1949. These battle-hardened, well-organized troops were among the first to systematize the opium trade in the region. Lo Hsing Han learned from them, partnered with them, and eventually surpassed them. They provided an early model of how an army could be sustained through narcotics, a lesson he took to its ultimate conclusion. On the victim side, the most immediate were the people of the Shan State. Farmers were trapped in a cycle of debt, peonage, their lives and lands controlled by the traffickers. Villages were often caught in the crossfire between the Burmese army, various insurgent groups, and the warlord's private armies. Extortion, forced labor, and violence were commonplace. The promise of quick wealth also lured many young Shan men into becoming soldiers or couriers for the syndicates, a dangerous occupation with a short life expectancy. Women and children were vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. The environment suffered too, as vast swathes of forest were cleared for poppy fields and clandestine labs polluted waterways with toxic chemical runoff. The victims extended globally to the countless individuals and families devastated by heroin addiction. Every dose of heroin that reached the streets of New York, Sydney, or Amsterdam could trace its lineage back to the laboratories and decision-making of men like Lo Hsing Han. He was several steps removed from the street level, suffering, insulated by layers of lieutenants and geography, but the supply chain he mastered was the direct cause of that suffering. Then there were the corrupted, the Thai police colonels, the Burmese intelligence officers, the border officials, and the bankers who willingly became cogs in his machine. Their moral compromise, traded for money and power, was a key pillar of his empire. He understood that every man had a price, and he was willing to pay it. This extended to the highest levels of business and politics in Myanmar later on, where association with Asia world became a symbol of connection to power, regardless of its origins. Finally, there were the institutions and nations weakened by his trade. The integrity of law enforcement and judicial systems in Thailand and Burma was severely undermined. The flood of narcotics dollar distorted local economies and fueled other forms of crime. Internationally, his success was a persistent challenge to global drug prohibition efforts, proving the resilience and adaptability of illicit networks. Lo Hsing Han did not operate in a vacuum. He was a product of his environment, and, in turn, became one of its principal architects. The gallery of characters around him, from the rival warlord Kunsa to the indebted farmer, from the corrupted general to the addicted teenager on another continent, forms a complete portrait of the ecosystem of a drug empire. Each was connected to the other by the invisible, sticky thread of heroin, a thread spun from the poppies of Shan State and pulled taut by the ruthless ambition of a few men at the top. His story, therefore, is not just a biography of a single criminal, but a sprawling epic of interconnected lives, all orbiting the dark sun of the narcotics trade, whose gravity pulled in the ambitious, the desperate, the greedy, and the innocent alike, leaving a legacy of ruin that spanned mountains, borders, and generation. The evolution of Lo Hsing Han's empire from a clandestine heroin operation into the legitimate-seeming corporate behemoth Asia world represents one of the most audacious acts of money laundering and state capture in modern criminal history. This transformation was not a departure from his criminal roots, but rather their ultimate sophistication, a final stage where illicit wealth sought and achieved the permanence, respectability, and political protection that only deep integration into a nation's formal economy and power structure could provide. The process began in earnest after his 1981 release, when the capital accumulated from decades of narcotics trafficking hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars needed a new home. It was dirty money on a scale that could not be simply parked in offshore accounts. It had to be cleansed through investment in tangible, income-generating assets. Asia World was the vehicle for this great cleansing, initially focusing on sectors where his existing networks gave him an advantage import-export. Shipping, logistics, and trading. The company quickly expanded into construction and infrastructure, sectors that were perfect for money laundering. Construction projects involve huge capital outlays, complex subcontracting, variable costs, and long timelines, making it exceptionally easy to inflate invoices, create fake companies, and move vast sums of money while creating a physical, respectable asset at the end. When Asia World built a highway, a port, or an airport, the true cost was obscured. Funds from drug profits could be funneled into the project as investment, mixed with legitimate state loans or contracts, and emerge as a profitable, legal piece of national infrastructure. The company became a master of securing government contracts, often without transparent bidding processes. This was no accident. In the crony capitalist system of Myanmar's junta, such contracts were rewards for loyalty and services rendered. Lo Hsing Han's service was pacifying the borderlands and providing a financial conduit for the elite. As Asia World grew, it diversified into natural resources, securing lucrative logging and mining concessions, often in ethnic minority areas where his influence or that of his ceasefire allies was strong. It moved into real estate development, tourism, and even consumer goods. With his son Stephen Law at the helm for day-to-day operations, the company adopted a modern corporate facade with office in Yangon's prime business districts and partnerships with foreign firms, particularly from China and Singapore. This veneer of legitimacy was crucial. It allowed the company to interact with the international business community, access technology, and further obscure the origins of its wealth. The ultimate symbol of this transformation was the company's role in building Myanmar's physical connectivity, the roads, bridges, and ports that were meant to signify the nation's development. Lo Hsing Han, the man whose earlier highways were jungle paths for heroin mules, was now literally paving the nation's official roads. The irony was profound and intentionally overlooked by the regime that benefited from it. This corporate empire served multiple strategic purposes beyond laundering money. It provided legitimate employment and patronage, creating a wide network of people whose livelihoods depended on Asia World, thus bolstering his social and political standing. It gave him a seat at the table of national policy, as the junta relied on his company to execute its key infrastructure projects. It also provided a perfect cover for any ongoing illicit activities. The company's shipping and logistics arm could easily handle dual-use cargo. Its vast land holdings in border areas could conceal laboratories or storage facilities. Its security personnel could act as enforcers. Most importantly, it tied his fate inextricably to the fate of the military regime. By the 2000s, Asia World was not just a company favored by the junta, it was a pillar of the junta's own economic power. Its success was their success. Its stability was their stability. Attacking Lo Hsing Han would mean attacking a core component of the state's economic engine and destabilizing the fragile ceasefire agreements he helped broker. This deep entanglement made him virtually untouchable from within Myanmar. International sanctions, like the U.S. kingpin designation, were an annoyance but not a fatal blow. They isolated the company from the Western financial system, but did nothing to hinder its operations with Asia, where alternative financing from Chinese banks and other regional players was readily available. The sanctions even served a domestic purpose for the junta, allowing them to portray Lo Hsing Han as a victim of Western bullying, a patriotic businessman, unjustly targeted for helping develop his nation. This narrative was propagated in state-controlled media, further cementing his rehabilitated image. The story of Asia World is therefore the story of how crime, when executed on a grand enough scale and with sufficient political intelligence, can transcend its own origins. It ceases to be a mere illegal activity and becomes a system of power itself. Lo Hsing Han achieved what few criminals ever do. He built a legacy in concrete and steel, the ports that handle Myanmar's trade, the highways that connect its cities, the airports that welcome visitors. Many bear the invisible imprint of his heroin empire. This is his most enduring and disturbing triumph. He demonstrated that in a weak and corrupt state, the proceeds of crime can become the foundations of the formal economy, and the architect of a global scourge can be reborn as a nation builder. His past crimes sanitized by present utility. His journey from the jungle lab to the corporate boardroom is a chilling blueprint for criminal success, showing that the ultimate victory is not to evade the law, but to rewrite it in your favor, not to hide from power, but to become synonymous with it. The international response to Lo Hsing Han's empire, particularly from the United States, forms a critical counter-narrative to his story of untouchable power. Within Myanmar, a tale of frustrated justice and the often clumsy tools of global governance when confronted with a criminal shielded by national sovereignty. From the moment American agencies like the DEA identified him as a principal source of the heroin flooding into the United States in the 1970s, he became a prime target. Yet, for decades, he existed just beyond their reach, a phantom in the Golden Triangle's mist. The initial strategy relied on proxy pressure and classic law enforcement tactics. The U.S. provided training and resources to Thai narcotics units, hoping interdiction at Bangkok's ports or along the border would choke the supply chain. They gathered intelligence through aerial surveillance, informants, and signal intercepts, painstakingly mapping his networks. They pushed for extradition, but these requests vanished into the void of Burma's political chaos, or were outright rejected. His 1973 arrest by the Burmese was initially seen as a breakthrough, but it quickly turned into a geopolitical complication. He was now in the custody of a hostile, reclusive regime that the U.S. had limited leverage over. His subsequent release in 1981 and his rehabilitation as a state partner made the situation even more diplomatically fraught. Targeting him now meant directly confronting the Burmese junta, a regime already under various U.S. sanctions for human rights abuses, but one that held him as a valuable asset. The primary American weapon became financial. The landmark move was the 1996 designation by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, naming Lo Hsing Han a specially designated narcotics trafficker under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. This was not a criminal conviction in a court of law, but an administrative act of economic warfare. It froze any assets he or his entities had under U.S. jurisdiction and prohibited any American individual or company from conducting business with them. The accompanying press release was unequivocal, detailing his narcotics history and stating that his legitimate businesses were fronts for laundering drug money. This designation was a significant blow to his international aspiration. It scared away Western investors and banks, complicating any plans Asia world might have had for expanding into markets reliant on the U.S. financial system. It placed his son and heir Stephen Law under the same restrictions, casting a long shadow over the company's future. The U.S. government continued to update and reinforce these sanctions over the year, adding other family members and associated companies to the list. They also lobbied allies, particularly in Europe and Asia, to impose similar restrictions. The impact, however, was asymmetric. While it successfully quarantined Lo Hsing Han from the formal Western economy, it did little to hinder his operations in his home region. Asia world thrived by pivoting eastward, forging deep partnerships with Chinese state-owned enterprise and Singaporean firms, and tapping into alternative financial circuits in Southeast Asia. The sanctions, in a perverse way, may have even strengthened his bond with the Burmese junta, as both became mutual pariahs of the West, united in their defiance. The U.S. also pursued legal avenues in absentia. In 2005, a federal court in New York indicted him and several associates on charges of narcotic trafficking and conspiracy, part of a broader case targeting the Shan United Army's heroin network. This was a symbolic act, a statement that American justice had not forgotten him. But with no possibility of extradition, it was a paper tiger. The indictment did, however, provide a detailed public record of his alleged crimes for posterity, beyond official government action. Lo Hsing Han faced relentless scrutiny from investigative journalists and non-governmental organizations. Reports from groups like the Shan Human Rights Foundation and journalists like Bertil Lintner meticulously documented the ongoing link between Asia world as construction sites and the heroin trade. the human rights abuses associated with his projects, and the company's role in laundering money for the junta. This kept his name in the realm of international infamy, countering the sanitized version propagated within Myanmar. Yet, for all this pressure, the sanctions, the indictments, the damning reports, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. On the ground in Myanmar, Lo Hsing Han lived freely and powerfully until his death. The international community could not pierce the sovereign shield provided by the Burmese military. His story thus exposes the limits of external pressure against a criminal who achieves what is known as state capture. When a criminal enterprise becomes so entwined with a nation's governing elite and economic infrastructure, traditional tools of law enforcement and even financial sanctions have limited efficacy. The target is protected not by hiding, but by being openly integrated into the halls of power. The U.S. campaign against Lo Hsing Han was a study in determination, but also in frustration. It demonstrated that while global powers can brand and isolate a kingpin, they cannot always apprehend or dismantle his empire if it is hosted by a state willing to provide sanctuary. His life stands as a case study in the enduring power of sanctuary, proving that in a world of sovereign nations, a ruthless man with the right connections can build a fortress of money and political influence that even the world's most powerful government could not storm. The international response, though vigorous, ultimately became part of his legend, a testament to his perceived importance on the world stage, another chapter in the saga of the untouchable warlord who outmaneuvered not just local enemies but global superpowers. From his remote stronghold in the hills of Southeast Asia, the human and social devastation wrought by Lo Hsing Han's empire forms a vast and silent ocean of suffering against which his personal story of power and wealth is but a grotesque, isolated island. To measure his impact solely in tons of heroin moved or billions of dollars laundered is to miss the profound human tragedy that was the true product of his enterprise. This suffering began at the very source, in the poppy fields of the Shan State. Here, farmers, often from ethnic minorities like the Dvalier, Shan and Kachin, lived in a state of economic bondage. Lo Hsing Han's system, replicated by other traffickers, ensured they remained trapped. Advances on future opium harvests tied them to the syndicate with chains of debt. The price they received for their raw opium was kept artificially low, while the cost of necessities sold to them by the same syndicate was inflated. This created a cycle of poverty from which escape was nearly impossible. Switching to legal crops like rice or corn was economically non-viable. The infrastructure for market access was poor, and the profit margins were a fraction of opium's. Furthermore, doing so could invite retribution from the armed groups that controlled the territory. The farmers were not becoming rich. They were merely surviving, their labor fueling a machine that enriched others far away. Their children grew up in a normalized culture of narcotics production, with limited access to education or alternative futures. The environmental cost was also severe, as forests were slashed and burned for poppy fields, leading to soil erosion and loss of biodiversity. Violence was a constant shadow. Villages were frequently caught in the crossfire between the Burmese army, various insurgent groups, and the private armies of the warlords. Forced conscription of young men as porters or soldiers was common. Extortion and arbitrary taxation by multiple armed actors bled communities dry. Women were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and trafficking. The social fabric of these communities was torn apart by the pressure of the drug economy and the relentless conflict it financed. This localized suffering was the first ripple in a pond that spread across the world. The next wave of victims were the couriers and low-level operatives in the smuggling chain. Many were poor young men and women desperate for a large payoff. They risked their lives swallowing condoms packed with heroin or carrying hidden packages across borders. If the packages ruptured internally, death was agonizing and swift. If caught by authorities, they faced decades in harsh prisons, often in foreign countries. While the kingpins remained free, they were the expendable pawns in Lo Hsing Han's chess game. Then came the addicts, the ultimate consumers of the product. The heroin that flowed from his laboratories was of exceptional purity, making it both powerfully addictive and deadly. In the 1970s, it devastated the ranks of American soldiers in Vietnam, ruining lives and complicating the war effort. As the market shifted, It fueled addiction epidemics in cities across America, Europe, and Australia. The human cost here is incalculable. Lives lost to overdose, families shattered by addiction, careers destroyed, and communities blighted by drug-related crime and disease. The spread of HIV, AIDS in the 1980s and 90s was dramatically accelerated in many parts of the world by intravenous heroin use. Each statistic represents a personal story of anguish, a story that began in a decision made in a jungle laboratory financed and protected by Lo Hsing Han's organization. Beyond the direct victims of addiction were the wider societies burdened by the consequences. Healthcare systems strained under the cost of treating overdoses and addiction-related illnesses. Law enforcement resources were diverted to fight a seemingly unwinnable war against the drug trade. Crime rates in urban areas fueled by heroin addiction put entire neighborhoods under siege. The economic productivity lost to addiction is a figure that can never be fully tallied. Furthermore, the corrupting influence of heroin money weakened institutions in transit countries like Thailand, where it fostered a culture of impunity among officials on the take. The most perverse aspect of this suffering is its stark contrast with the life of its architect. While millions grappled with the consequences of his trade, Lo Hsing Han lived in increasing luxury and security. He transitioned from jungle camps to a fortified compound in Yangon. He enjoyed the protection of a state that he had made complicit in his crimes. He saw his wealth sanctified through legitimate business, and his legacy rebranded as that of a developer. He died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by family, and was mourned by the very establishment that should have held him accountable. This dichotomy is the heart of the moral horror of his story. He externalized all the costs of his business, the violence, the addiction, the corruption, the environmental damage on the most vulnerable, the impoverished farmer, the desperate courier, the addicted youth, the terrorized village. He internalized all the benefits, the power, the wealth, the status, the impunity. His empire was a machine for converting human misery into personal and political capital. The true scale of Lo Hsing Han's criminality, therefore, cannot be found in a ledger of drug shipments or a portfolio of construction projects. It is found in the silent, ongoing trauma of the Shan Highlands, in the graves of overdose victims on distant continents, in the broken families, and in the corrupted souls of officials who traded their integrity for his money. His story is a reminder that the most successful criminals are not those who commit the most blatant act of violence, but those who orchestrate systems that produce violence and suffering at a remove, allowing them to profit from a catastrophe they engineered but never have to personally witness. The legacy of the Godfather of Heroin is not just a corporate conglomerate. It is a world of pain, the full dimensions of which may never be fully known, a dark testament to the fact that the most profitable commodity in human history is, and has always been, human suffering itself. The geopolitical landscape of the Cold War provided the perfect petri dish for the incubation and explosive growth of Lo Hsing Han's narcotic empire, a fact that places his story not on the fringe of 20th century history, but squarely within its central, turbulent narrative. Southeast Asia in the 1950s through the 1980s was not merely a region of local conflict. It was a chessboard for superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and later China. This global confrontation created conditions of chronic instability, proxy warfare, and a paramount focus on political and military objectives that often blinded actors to the cancerous growth of the drug trade. The Burmese civil war itself was deeply enmeshed in this dynamic. The central government in Rangoon, while officially non-aligned, battled both communist insurgents backed by China and ethnic rebel groups. The United States, obsessed with containing communism, initially provided support to the Kuomintang remnant who had fled to the Golden Triangle, viewing them as a potential anti-communist guerrilla force. These KMT troops, cut off from supplies, turned to opium trading to fund their operation, establishing the first large-scale militarized narcotics networks in the region. They became the proto-models for warlords like Lo Hsing Han. As the U.S. deepened its involvement in Vietnam, the entire region became a strategic priority, but the priority was military victory, not social stability or law enforcement. The CIA and other U.S. assets in the region sometimes formed alliances of convenience with anti-communist militias and hill tribes. Regardless of their involvement in the opium trade, the famous Air America fleet, the CIA's proprietary airline, was even alleged by investigators and journalists to have occasionally transported opium for its local allies. Though these claims remain controversial, the crucial point is that in the calculus of Cold War strategy, the drug trade was a secondary concern, a nuisance sometimes tolerated if it helped achieve the primary goal of checking communist expansion. Lo Hsing Han masterfully exploited this geopolitical myopia. He presented himself, when necessary, as a bulwark against communism. His Shan United Army fought against communist insurgents, which aligned with both Burmese and American interests at time. This allowed him to sometimes operate with a degree of tacit tolerance, or at least distracted attention. The sheer chaos of the region, fueled by superpower proxy conflicts, provided the perfect cover. Governments were too focused on fighting each other to effectively police the remote borderlands where opium flourished and heroin labs operated. The flow of arms into the region from various sources, including the black markets fed by the Vietnam War, easily found their way into the hands of traffickers, strengthening their private armies. The heroin itself became a weapon of sorts, albeit an indiscriminate one. Its devastating impact on American troops in Vietnam served to demoralize the U.S. military, a strategic blow that benefited the communist forces. While there is no evidence Lo Hsing Han directly intended this, his business inevitably had geopolitical consequences. Later, as the Cold War wound down, the dynamics shifted, but the entrenched systems remained. The drug trade had become a self-sustaining economy, a parallel power structure that outlasted the ideological conflict that had midwifed it. Lo Hsing Han's later partnership with the Burmese junta can also be seen through a geopolitical lens. In the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Myanmar was isolated and sanctioned by the West. It turned to China for economic and political support. Lo Hsing Han's Asia world, with its massive infrastructure projects like pipelines and ports, became a key vehicle for Chinese investment and strategic access to the Indian Ocean. His empire thus evolved from being a beneficiary of Cold War chaos to a facilitator of post-Cold War Chinese economic expansion. He was a constant, adaptable figure in a changing world, always finding a way to align his criminal enterprise with the prevailing geopolitical currents. This context is vital for understanding why he was so difficult to stop. He was not just a criminal. He was a phenomenon born of a specific and brutal historical moment. The very forces that shaped the modern world, decolonization, superpower rivalry, and civil war, created the vacuum he filled and provided the tools he used. Attempts by individual nations, like the United States, to target him were often undermined by broader strategic consideration. Pressuring the Burmese junta too hard on narcotics could push them further into China's arms. Cooperating with Thai authorities was complicated by the fact that elements of the Thai state were corrupt, and the U.S. needed Thailand as a military ally. Lo Hsing Han's genius was his ability to nest his operations within these larger, unmanageable conflicts. He was a parasite on the body of the Cold War, feeding on its violence and distraction. His story, therefore, serves as a grim postscript to the 20th century, a reminder that while the grand ideological battles between capitalism and communism have faded, one of their most toxic byproducts, the militarized, globalized drug trade, remains a powerful and destructive force. The Godfather of Heroin was, in a real sense, a creation of his times, a demon summoned by the chaos of great power politics, who then learned to outlive the era that created him, adapting his infernal business to the new world order, leaving behind a legacy that continues to poison the land, its people, long after the guns of the Cold War have fallen silent. The psychological portrait of Lo Hsing Han is a study in contradictions and calculated restraint, revealing a man whose inner life was as strategically guarded as his jungle fortresses, and whose personal demeanor defied the stereotypical image of a flamboyant, hedonistic crime lord. Unlike his rival Kun Sa, who held court with journalists and cultivated a Robin Hood persona, Lo Hsing Han was intensely private, disciplined, and operated from a place of quiet, formidable calculation. He was known to be abstemious. He did not smoke, drank little, and crucially, did not use the heroin that made him rich. This detachment from his own product was a key to his longevity and operational clarity. He saw heroin not as a substance of pleasure, but purely as a commodity, a unit of economic and political power. This clinical dispassion allowed him to make decisions based on cold logic, free from the clouded judgment of addiction or the recklessness of indulgence. He was described by those who met him as having a piercing gaze, speaking softly but with an air of undeniable authority. He was a listener, absorbing information before acting, a trait that made him a master of negotiation and strategy. His leadership style within his organization was not based on charismatic inspiration, but on a clear hierarchy enforced by ruthless discipline. Loyalty was rewarded handsomely, but betrayal or failure was met with swift and often terminal punishment. He cultivated an aura of fear and inevitability. His word was final, and his reach was long. This created an organization that was more akin to a disciplined military corporate entity than a chaotic gang, capable of executing complex, long-term plans across international borders. His personal motivations appear to have been rooted in a profound drive for power and autonomy, rather than mere wealth accumulation. Growing up in the fractured, violent world of post-colonial Shan State, he internalized a worldview where strength was the only true currency, and where reliance on any higher authority was a fatal weakness. His ambition was to become the ultimate authority in his realm, to create a self-sustaining system where he answered to no one. This explains his relentless focus on building his own army, securing his own territory, and controlling every link in the supply chain. Wealth was a tool for this ambition, a means to buy weapons, bribe officials, and ensure loyalty later in life. When offered the chance to trade some of his outlaw autonomy for state-sanctioned power through Asia world, he took it, but on his own terms. He did not become a subservient tool of the junta. He became a partner, a pillar of the state. This transition required a different kind of intelligence, political acumen. He learned to navigate the Byzantine politics of the Burmese military, to cultivate generals, and to present himself as a necessary, patriotic force for development and stability. His public persona in Yangon was that of a reclusive, pious businessman. He made large donations to Buddhist monasteries, a crucial act for gaining social merit and political protection in Myanmar. He funded local infrastructure projects in areas under his influence, building schools and clinics not out of altruism, but as a form of patronage that bolstered his local control and burnished his image. This ability to wear different masks, the ruthless jungle warlord, the shrewd ceasefire broker, the pious philanthropist, the corporate titan, speaks to a deep psychological flexibility. He was a consummate pragmatist, devoid of a rigid ideology, always adapting his self-presentation to suit his goals. His personal life was kept fiercely private. He married and had children. He focused on building a dynasty, grooming his son, Stephen Law, to inherit and legitimize the business empire. This focus on legacy indicates a man thinking beyond his own lifetime, aiming to transform fleeting criminal wealth into enduring institutional and family power. Yet, beneath this veneer of control and calculation, one can speculate on the psychological cost to orchestrate a trade that caused mass addiction and death, to order executions, to live in a perpetual state of strategic warfare even amidst luxury, must have required a profound suppression of empathy, a compartmentalization of morality. Lo Hsing Han represented a particular archetype of evil, not the hot-blooded psychopath, but the cold administrative architect of suffering. He was a manager of misery, a CEO of despair. His psychological strength was his ability to rationalize his action within the framework of survival and ambition in a brutal world. He likely saw himself not as a monster, but as a lord of his domain, a provider for his family and followers, a player in a game where the rules were written by violence. This self-justification, combined with his discipline and intelligence, made him exceptionally dangerous and resilient. He did not succumb to the paranoia or decadence that topples many crime lords. He evolved. In the end, the psychology of Lo Hsing Han remains partially opaque, shrouded in his own deliberate silence. But the contours that emerge are of a man whose greatest talent was his understanding of systems of power, of conflict, of human greed, and his ability to manipulate them without being consumed by the baser instincts that often accompany absolute power. He was a strategic genius applied to a morally bankrupt enterprise, a quiet man whose whispers moved mountains of heroin, and whose calm gaze oversaw an ocean of blood, tears, a testament to the terrifying fact that the most effective agents of chaos are often those who appear on the surface to be the most composed and in control. The legacy of Lo Hsing Han is a living, breathing entity in modern Myanmar, etched not only in the corporate structures of Asia world, but in the very political and economic DNA of the nation, a toxic inheritance that continues to shape its troubled present. His death in 2013 did not mark the end of his influence. It merely transferred its management to a new generation and cemented his model of state criminal fusion as a perverse template for power. Asia world remains one of the country's largest and most powerful conglomerates, deeply involved in strategic sectors from ports and logistics to energy and urban development. Under the leadership of his son, Stephen Law, the company has navigated Myanmar's political transitions from direct military rule to a hybrid civilian military government and through the violent return to full junta control following the 2021 coup. Throughout these upheavals, Asia world has retained its privileged position, a testament to the enduring nature of the alliances Lo Hsing Han forged. The company's continued success underscores a brutal truth. In Myanmar, the capital accumulated from narcotics and conflict was not purged during periods of reform. It was institutionalized. It became foundational capital, and those who controlled it became untouchable oligarchs, their past sanitized by present economic necessity. This legacy perpetuates the cycle of violence in the ethnic borderlands. The ceasefire agreements Lo Hsing Han helped broker in the 1990s often created what are known as ceasefire capitalism zones, where former rebel groups turned border guard forces or militia were given commercial concession and autonomy in exchange for not fighting the central government. In many cases, these groups' primary revenue source remained narcotics production and trafficking. The political protection for this trade, once provided personally by Lo Hsing Han, is now embedded in the system itself. The opium and methamphetamine production in Shan State has, by many estimates, skyrocketed in the years since his death, with Myanmar becoming the world's largest producer of methamphetamine. The blueprint he helped design using narcotics to fund armed groups who then make deals with the state for autonomy is now standard operating procedure. The human rights abuses associated with his empire also continue. Mega projects initiated by Asia World, such as the Mae Tswan Dam or the pipelines to China, have been linked to large-scale land confiscations, forced displacement, and environmental destruction, often with the backing of military security. The company's operations in conflict zones indirectly finance military operations against ethnic armed organizations. Thus, the suffering Lo Hsing Han directly inflicted in the 20th century is now replicated through systems he helped put in place. His legacy also represents a profound obstacle to genuine reform and justice in Myanmar. For any future democratic or accountable government, dismantling the economic power of conglomerates like Asia World would be a Herculean task. They are too big to fail, too entrenched in the daily function of the economy, and too connected to the still dominant military. Holding them accountable for their origins in drug trafficking and corruption would threaten the entire elite power structure. This creates a form of national moral paralysis. Furthermore, his story sends a dangerous message to aspiring power brokers that the most lucrative and secure path to wealth and influence is through the fusion of illicit activity and political alliance, rather than through lawful enterprise. Internationally, his legacy lives on in the ongoing U.S. sanctions against Asia World and the Law family, a permanent marker of their criminal origins in the ledgers of global finance. For scholars and law enforcement, his life remains the premier case study in the evolution of a drug lord into a state-sanctioned oligarch, a roadmap of how to launder not just money, but an entire reputation, transforming from a wanted criminal into a national developer. Yet, perhaps the most poignant aspect of his legacy is its effect on the historical memory of Myanmar itself. Within the country, particularly among the urban elite and in official circles. Lo Hsing Han is often remembered selectively. The narrative emphasizes his later role as a peace broker and businessman, while the title Godfather of Heroin is treated as a Western exaggeration or an artifact of a distant past. This selective amnesia is a necessary component of the system he helped build. To acknowledge the full horror of his origins would be to implicate too much of the contemporary power structure. Therefore, his legacy is one of divided memory, international infamy versus domestic rehabilitation, a kingpin to the world, a tycoon to his nation. In the final analysis, Lo Hsing Han did not just build a drug empire, he helped build a certain kind of state where crime and authority are inseparable, where borders between the legal and illegal are meaningless, and where power is derived from the control of violence and addiction. His legacy is not a ghost from the past, it is the architecture of the present. The roads his company built are driven on every day, the ports it operates are gateways for the nation. His trade, the conflicts it helped pacify through cynical deals continue to simmer and explode. He achieved a form of immortality, not through honor, but through embedded influence. His story warns us that the most dangerous criminals are not those who are caught and punished, but those who succeed so completely that they change the rules of the game itself, ensuring their poisonous legacy becomes a permanent feature of the landscape, a mountain of sorrow built one brick of heroin, one bar of gold, and one complicit silence at a time. To fully grasp the operational genius of Lo Hsing Han, one must dissect the sophisticated financial architecture that underpinned his empire, a system that evolved from simple cash exchanges and jungle clearings to a complex global money laundering network that ultimately fused with the nation's formal banking and investment streams. The initial challenge was monumental, converting the physical profits from street-level heroin sales in places like New York or Sydney back into usable capital in the remote Golden Triangle, all while evading the detection of law enforcement agencies worldwide. The early system relied on the ancient hawala, or hundi system, an informal value transfer method based on trust and family connection. Drug money collected in the West would be given to a hawala broker in, say, Bangkok or Hong Kong. That broker would then instruct a counterpart in the Golden Triangle to deliver the equivalent value in local currency to Lo Hsing Han's representatives, with no physical movement of cash across borders. This method was fast, left little paper trail, and was deeply entrenched in Asian commerce. As volumes grew, more structured methods were needed. Lo Hsing Han's organization began establishing front companies, initially in the trading hubs of Southeast Asia. These were import-export firms, gem dealerships, or trading companies that could generate fake invoices. A shipment of teakwood from Myanmar to Singapore might be invoiced at 10 times its actual value. The excess payment, originating from drug profits held offshore, would be transferred to the front company's bank account at payment for the inflated invoice, thereby laundering the money through what appeared to be a legitimate trade transaction. Another method involved the purchase of easily transportable, high-value commodities like gold, jade, and rubies from Myanmar's rich mines. These could be smuggled to Thailand or Hong Kong, sold for clean cash, and the proceeds invested or repatriated. The gem trade, in particular, with its subjective valuations and murky supply chains, was a perfect laundering vehicle. A significant portion of the profits was reinvested directly into the business purchasing weapons, precursor, chemicals, bribes, and paying salaries, which required less formal laundering as it stayed within the illicit ecosystem. However, the leap to mega-scale laundering occurred with the founding of Asia World and Lo Hsing Han's partnership with the Burmese state. This provided a mechanism of breathtaking scale and audacity, laundering drug capital through national infrastructure development. When Asia World won a contract to build a highway for the government, it could inflate costs exponentially. Money from offshore accounts, representing decades of heroin profits, could be invested in the project or used to cover these inflated costs. The state, often paying for the project itself or through international loans, would in effect be funneling money through the contract back into Lo Hsing Han's coffers, now clean and tagged as construction revenue. The physical asset, the highway, stood as a monument to the laundering process. This method was not only effective but also strategically brilliant. It turned the state into an unwitting or witting partner in the laundering scheme. It provided a seemingly endless sink for vast sums of money. Furthermore, It allowed for the integration of his wealth into the legitimate financial system of Myanmar and, through partnerships with foreign firms, into the regional economy. Banks in Singapore, Thailand, and China, eager for business, would handle transactions for a large construction conglomerate without asking too many probing questions about its ultimate ownership. The U.S. Treasury's 1996 designation aimed to rupture these international banking links, forcing Asia world to rely more on regional partners outside the Western financial system, which it successfully did. Another key aspect of his financial architecture was its focus on liquidity and diversification. Profits were not hoarded but constantly moved and transformed. They were invested in real estate in Yangon, Bangkok, and Singapore. They were used to purchase fleets of ships and trucks for his logistics arm. They were funneled into the tourism sector, building hotels that could also serve as hubs for moving people and contraband. This constant churn made the money difficult to trace and tied his economic interests to the growth of entire sectors. The role of his family, particularly his son Stephen Law, was crucial in this financial evolution. Educated abroad, Stephen Law understood international finance, corporate structuring, and how to present a legitimate face to the world. Under his guidance, Asia World adopted modern corporate practices, formed joint ventures with reputable foreign companies, and engaged with international markets, all of which provided further layers of obfuscation for the origin of the family's wealth. The financial legacy of Lo Hsing Han is thus a dual one. On one hand, it is a masterclass in illicit finance, demonstrating how to move, hide, and legitimize wealth on a scale that rivals small nations. On the other hand, it is a tragic case study in how illicit capital, when sufficiently vast, can fundamentally distort a developing economy. It creates a system where the most successful businessmen are not the most innovative or efficient, but those with the deepest pockets of dirty money and the strongest political connections to secure monopolies. It crowds out legitimate entrepreneurship and fosters an economy based on cronyism and rent-seeking. The financial architecture Lo Hsing Han pioneered did more than just clean his money. It helped build an economic system in Myanmar where crime and state power became financially inseparable. A system where the rivers of narcotics, dollars, and official revenue eventually flowed into the same sea, making it impossible to distinguish one drop from the other, and ensured that the economic foundations of the nation were, and remain, partially poured from the concrete of his poisoned wealth. The transformation of the Golden Triangle's opium trade under the influence of kingpins like Lo Hsing Han from a regional agricultural issue into a streamlined, industrial-scale heroin production machine represents a dark revolution in illicit manufacturing, a revolution that required not just agricultural know-how but advanced chemistry, international logistics, and a ruthless disregard for human life. In the early days, the trade was primarily in raw opium, a bulky and less potent substance. Lo Hsing Han's pivotal insight, shared by his rivals, was that the real profit and power lay in controlling the refinement process. Moving from opium to heroin was like moving from iron ore to finished steel. It exponentially increased the value, reduced the bulk for smuggling, and created a product with a global, insatiable demand. This shift required the establishment of hidden jungle laboratories, which became the beating hearts of his empire. These were not static facilities but mobile, temporary setups often constructed near water sources for the chemical process, and then dismantled to avoid detection. The chemists, sometimes recruited from Hong Kong or Thailand, were the alchemists of this dark trade. They required precursor chemicals like acetic anhydride, a substance with legitimate industrial uses but tightly controlled internationally. Lo Hsing Han's organization established sophisticated smuggling networks for the chemicals, often diverting them from legal shipments in India, China, or Thailand. The chemical process itself, the conversion of opium to morphine base, and then to heroin hydrochloride, the pure powdered form, was dangerous and toxic, but his operations scaled it up relentlessly. Quality control became a hallmark to capture and retain market share, especially the lucrative American market. His labs produced number 4 heroin, renowned for its high purity, sometimes exceeding 90%. This purity was a branding tool, creating user demand for his product specifically. the industrial mindset extended to the workforce. Local villagers were often employed as guards or laborers at these remote sites, paid with opium or minimal wages, and exposed to hazardous chemicals without protection. Environmental devastation was a direct byproduct. Chemical runoff from these labs poisoned rivers and soil, killing fish and contaminate water supplies for downstream villages, creating silent, long-term health crisis. The refinement process also changed the agricultural front. To feed these labs, a consistent and voluminous supply of raw opium was needed. This increased pressure on the hill tribe farmers to plant more poppy, often at the expense of food crops, deepening their dependency and causing food insecurity. Lo Hsing Han's agents provided seeds, even encouraged the cultivation of higher yield poppy varieties, and enforced planting quotas. The entire Shan State, in many areas, became a monocrop economy for heroin, its landscape, and livelihood reshaped to serve the chemical demands of the jungle labs. The output of these laboratories was then packaged for its global journey with corporate efficiency. Heroin was compressed into blocks, often stamped with distinctive logos: a tiger, a globe, a crown as a brand identifier for wholesalers. These blocks were then wrapped in plastic and sometimes smeared with garlic or other strong-smelling substances to confuse drug-sniffing dogs. The packaging was designed for durability and concealment. This industrial output necessitated an equally industrial smuggling apparatus. Lo Hsing Han did not just move product. He managed a supply chain. He had specialists in transportation, experts in modifying vehicles with hidden compartments, captains for river and coastal boats, and coordinators who knew the schedules and vulnerabilities of border checkpoints. He employed scouts and corruption managers whose sole job was to monitor law enforcement movements and ensure bribes were delivered to the right officials at the right time. This was a business with research and development, quality assurance, branding, logistics, and human resources, all devoted to the manufacture and distribution of a deadly narcotic. The shift to heroin also had a catastrophic multiplier effect on public health worldwide. Smokable opium, the traditional form, was addictive and destructive, but injectable heroin was a different order of magnitude. Its potency led to faster, deeper addiction, and a much higher risk of fatal overdose. The HIV/AIDS pandemic was supercharged by the proliferation of cheap, pure heroin, as users shared needles. Thus, the industrial chemical process Lo Hsing Han mastered in the jungles of Shan State did not just produce a drug. It produced addiction epidemics, disease vectors, and mortality statistics on a scale that raw opium never could. His legacy in this regard is one of technical innovation in the service of human devastation. He took a cottage industry and turned it into a multinational pharmaceutical company from hell, with no ethics committee, no regulatory oversight, and a business model entirely dependent on creating and maintaining physical and psychological dependency in millions of people. The laboratories are mostly gone now, but the template remains. Today, the golden triangle has shifted significantly to the industrial-scale production of methamphetamine, a synthetic drug that requires even more chemical expertise, but follows the same logistical and financial blueprints Lo Hsing Han perfected. The chemical revolution he helped pioneer in the service of heroin created the infrastructure, the corruption networks, and the business mentality that now fuels the global meth and fentanyl crisis. The jungle labs may now produce different molecules, but they operate in the shadow of the system he built, a system that proved that with enough ruthlessness and organization, the most remote corner of the world can become the factory floor for global suffering. Its production lines hidden in the fog, its owners insulated by wealth and power, and its product a testament to the horrifying potential of criminal industrialization. The narrative of Lo Hsing Han's life and empire, when held up against the broader tapestry of global organized crime, reveals not an anomaly, but a paradigm, a definitive archetype of the narco-warlord whose strategies and ultimate state capture find echoes in figures from Colombia's Pablo Escobar to Mexico's Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, yet with uniquely Southeast Asian characteristics that make his story a singular textbook of criminal adaptation. Like Escobar, Lo Hsing Han built a private army, waged war against the state when necessary, and used unimaginable wealth to corrupt officials and cultivate a populist image in his home region through philanthropy. However, where Escobar's Medellin cartel was a challenge to the Colombian state from within a fundamentally democratic, if fragile, framework, Lo Hsing Han operated in a region where the state's authority was already contested by multiple insurgencies. He didn't just challenge a state, he expertly navigated a fractured landscape of state and non-state actors, becoming a power broker among them. His genius was in leveraging this fragmentation rather than merely confronting a monolithic government. Unlike Escobar, who was ultimately hunted down and killed, Lo Hsing Han achieved a longevity that Escobar could only dream of by transitioning from adversary to partner of the state. In this, he shares more with Mexican cartel leaders, who have at times operated with the tacit consent or direct corruption of elements within the government, but even there, the scale of his formal integration is staggering. He didn't just bribe officials, he became one in all but name, his corporation executing national policy. His trajectory mirrors that of a mafia boss who succeeds in going legitimate, but on the scale of an entire nation. Compared to his great rival Kunsa, Lo Hsing Han was the less flamboyant but arguably more effective strategist. Kunsa embraced the persona of a Shan nationalist leader, using the drug trade to fund a political cause. Lo Hsing Han was agnostic about nationalism. For him, political causes were tools, not beliefs. This pragmatism allowed him to cut deals with the Burmese junta that Kunsa, more ideologically committed, was slower to make. Lo Hsing Han's story is also a precursor to the modern phenomenon of the narco-state, where illicit drug revenues become central to a country's political economy. While Myanmar under the junta never became a full narco-state in the sense that the regime's survival was directly funded by drugs, Lo Hsing Han's Asia world created a critical nexus where drug money, state revenue, and legitimate business became indistinguishable, achieving a deep structural corruption that outlived him. His model has been studied by other transnational criminal organizations, particularly the lessons in money laundering through large-scale infrastructure and the strategic value of providing quasi-state services in lawless regions. Furthermore, his life underscores a grim geopolitical constant. Organized crime flourishes in the seams of conflict and political transition, just as the Sicilian mafia grew in the power vacuum of Italian unification, and Russian organized crime exploded after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Lo Hsing Han's empire was born from the chaos of colonial Burma and the Cold War proxy battles in Southeast Asia. He was a creature of his turbulent times, but one with the foresight to evolve when the times changed. His ability to survive the end of the Cold War, to rebrand himself during Myanmar's period of tentative reforms, and to have his empire endure the 2021 coup, speaks to a foundational resilience built on diversification and deep political embedding. In the pantheon of 20th century crime lords, Lo Hsing Han's unique place is secured by this quality of metamorphosis. He was not a gangster who remained a gangster. He was a warlord who became a tycoon, a trafficker who became a developer. His career path is perhaps the most successful in criminal terms because it achieved the ultimate goal, the transmutation of illicit power into accepted, institutionalized authority. While his name may not have the same instant global recognition as Escobar or El Chapo, his influence on the structures of power in Myanmar is arguably more profound and enduring. He proved that the most potent criminal is one who helps build the state, even if that state is corrupt and authoritarian, because in doing so, he builds his own permanent protection. His story is thus not just a chapter in the history of drug trafficking, but a dark lesson in political science and economics, a case study in how criminal capital can become foundational capital, and how a man deemed an enemy of the state can, through a combination of ruthlessness, pragmatism, and strategic genius, become one of its unspoken architects. The legacy of Lo Hsing Han, therefore, challenges the very definition of criminal success, pushing it beyond wealth and notoriety into the realm of legacy and systemic influence. A sobering reminder that in the shadowy intersection of crime and politics, the greatest victory is not to defy the system, but to become the system itself. The moral and ethical abyss at the core of Lo Hsing Han's empire forces a confrontation with uncomfortable questions about complicity, justice, and the nature of evil in a geopolitical context. His story is not a simple morality tale of a villain brought low, but a complex saga where traditional notions of justice were consistently thwarted, and where the lines between perpetrator, victim, and accomplice were deliberately smudged by design. From a purely retributive justice perspective, his life represents a profound failure. He was responsible for the addiction and death of countless thousands, for the corruption of governments, and for the brutal subjugation of entire regions. Yet he spent only a brief period in prison, engineered his own release, and lived the remainder of his life in luxury and power, dying peacefully in his bed, honored by the state. This outcome mocks the very idea of cosmic or judicial balance. It suggests a world where a scale of crime can, paradoxically, grant a form of immunity by making the criminal too big to fail, too embedded to prosecute without catastrophic collateral damage. The ethical dilemma extends to the actions of the Burmese state and its international partners. The junta's decision to commute his death sentence and later use him as a ceasefire broker and business partner was a coldly pragmatic calculation that traded justice for a perceived stability. Was this a morally defensible realpolitik, using a monster to tame other monsters and bring a fragile peace to war-torn regions? Or was it an unforgivable moral capitulation that legitimized narcotics wealth and guaranteed its perpetuation? The evidence suggests the latter, as the peace brokered was often a predatory consolidation of power that did little to address the root causes of conflict or addiction. Internationally, the complicity is more passive but pervasive. Western consumers created the demand that fueled his empire. Corrupt officials in Thailand and elsewhere actively enabled it. And for decades, the strategic priorities of the Cold War caused Western powers to downplay the drug trade in favor of anti-communist alliances, allowing figures like Lo Hsing Han to flourish in the shadows of larger conflicts. This collective failure points to a distributed ethical responsibility where the gravity of the crime is so vast that it implicates not just one man, but the global systems of conflict, economics, and addiction that allowed him to thrive. On a personal ethical level, Lo Hsing Han presents the archetype of the purely pragmatic actor, a man who operated in a moral vacuum. He did not seem driven by ideology, sadism, or even extravagant greed for its own sake, but by a calculated pursuit of autonomous power. This made him more terrifying, not less. His evil was bureaucratic, administrative. He was the factory manager of a suffering production plant, concerned with efficiency, output, and bottom lines, not with the human raw material being consumed. His later philanthropy building temples and schools can be seen not as atonement, but as a further strategic investment in social capital and Buddhist merit, a transaction to improve his standing in this life and the next, not a genuine reckoning with his past. It was the final stage of laundering his reputation. The question of whether such a man could ever have been redeemed is moot. He showed no interest in the concept. His life forces us to consider whether the frameworks we use to understand crime motives of poverty, passion, or ideology are inadequate to explain a phenomenon as coldly systemic as his empire. He was not a product of his impoverished childhood in any deterministic sense. He was a product of his ruthless intelligence applied to the chaotic opportunities of his environment. His story challenges the narrative of crime as a failure of society, presenting instead a case of criminality as a hyper-successful, if diabolical, adaptation to a broken society. Ultimately, the ethical legacy of Lo Hsing Han is one of corrosive normalcy. He normalized the idea that drug wealth could be washed clean through national development. He normalized the collaboration between warlords and generals. He normalized a world where the title Godfather of Heroin could coexist with the honorific U and a seat at the nation's high table. This normalization is perhaps his most damaging achievement, for it embeds criminality into the social and political fabric, making it not an aberration to be rooted out, but a feature to be managed. It creates a moral numbness, a collective shrug in the face of profound injustice. His life begs the question, what does justice even look like for a crime of such magnitude, committed by a man who successfully woven himself into the power structure of a nation? The answer, as his story tragically demonstrates, may be that in the real world, such justice is often incomplete, symbolic, or simply absent, leaving behind only the haunting, unresolved echo of suffering, and a chilling blueprint for future kingpins on how to achieve power, wealth, and a legacy that stand, literally and figuratively, in concrete and steel, impervious to the tears of its countless victims. As we approach the final reckoning of Lo Hsing Han's life, it is imperative to step back and view the panoramic sweep of his 80-year journey not as a series of discrete events, but as a single, coherent strategy of survival and dominion, executed with a patience and foresight that rivals that of nation-states. His was a life lived in concentric circles of power, each larger and more formidable than the last. The innermost circle was the personal, the disciplined, abstemious man who ruled through intelligence and fear, who trusted only a tight circle of family and loyalists, and who viewed emotions like mercy or grandiosity as strategic liabilities. This core of steel allowed him to build the next circle, the militarized commercial empire. Here, he was the warlord entrepreneur, merging the roles of general and CEO, commanding thousands of soldiers who were also smugglers, overseeing laboratories and caravans, and turning the Golden Triangle's chaos into a corporate asset. This circle made him rich and feared, but also vulnerable, a target for rivals and governments. His genius was in constructing the third and most enduring circle, the political and economic integration with the state. This was his masterstroke. By becoming indispensable to the Burmese junta, first as a ceasefire broker, then as a developer, he transcended the criminal label. He moved his operations from the vulnerable jungles to the protected boardrooms and construction sites of the nation's economy. He exchanged the fleeting power of the outlaw for the durable power of the oligarch. This third circle provided the sanctuary that allowed his legacy to enter a fourth, posthumous circle, institutional permanence. Through Asia world and his son's leadership, his influence became embedded in Myanmar infrastructure and financial systems, ensuring his family's power and wealth would endure political upheavals, surviving even the transition from direct military rule to a hybrid government and back to junta control after the 2021 coup. This four-circle strategy, personal discipline, militarized commerce, state capture, and institutional legacy forms the architectural blueprint of his life. It is a blueprint that explains his resilience. When the Burmese army arrested him, he survived because his knowledge was an asset they chose to preserve. When the U.S. sanctioned him, he thrived because he had built an economic fortress within Myanmar and its regional partnerships. When rivals like Kunsa fought him, he outmaneuvered them by making a better deal with the government. His life was a continuous process of adaptation, each phase building upon the last, never clinging sentimentally to a past mode of operation. He began as a soldier in the Shan Rebellion, became a drug lord, then a prisoner, then a peacemaker, then a tycoon, and finally a state-sponsored patriarch. Each identity was a shell he could shed when necessary, revealing a harder, more suitable one beneath. This chameleon-like quality was his ultimate defense. Furthermore, his story forces a re-evaluation of the very concept of a crime lord. He was not a mafia don controlling a city's underworld from a social club, nor a cartel leader hiding in mountains. He was, for a time, a territorial ruler, a maker of foreign policy, and a shaper of a nation's economy. His power was not parasitic in the end, it was symbiotic. He and the Burmese state became mutually reinforcing organisms. The state gave his wealth legitimacy and protection. He gave the state a tool for control, a channel for investment, and a partner in managing its most rebellious frontiers. This symbiotic relationship is the key to understanding why he died free and powerful. He was not an enemy that the state failed to defeat. He became a component the state chose not to live without. Looking at the full arc, one sees a terrifying logic. In a world of weak institutions, chronic conflict, and rampant corruption, the most rational path to supreme security and influence was the path he took. His immorality was, in the context of his environment, a form of hyper-rationality. This does not excuse his actions, but it explains their relentless, successful pattern. He was a perfect machine for converting the raw materials of war and opium into unassailable power. His life stands as a dark testament to human agency, a proof that a single individual, through sheer force of will, intelligence, and ruthlessness, can bend the chaotic forces of history to his purpose, not to build a nation in the light, but to forge an empire in the shadows, an empire so robust that its foundations would support the weight of a nation's own development, forever tainting progress with the indelible stain of its poisoned origins. The panoramic view of Lo Hsing Han's life, therefore, reveals not a chaotic villain, but a master strategist whose battlefield was the entire political and economic landscape of Southeast Asia, and whose ultimate victory was to die old, rich, and secure, leaving behind a system that continues to profit from the very miseries he once directly administered. The story of Lo Hsing Han, the Burmese warlord, does not conclude with his death in 2013. Instead, it dissipates like the morning fog over the Shan Hills, settling into the very soil and structures of Myanmar, becoming an inseparable part of its atmosphere, a permanent lesson in the corruptibility of power and the high price of impunity. His narrative is a dark mirror held up to the modern world, reflecting back the unsettling truth that in the gray zones where conflict, poverty, and greed converge, the most successful operators are often those who abandon conventional morality in favor of a brutal, transactional pragmatism. He demonstrated that the journey from the world's most wanted narcotic trafficker to a respected national businessman is not a fantasy, but a gruesome reality achievable through strategic patience, relentless ambition, and the systematic corruption of the state itself. His legacy is a dual-headed beast. On one side, the concrete and steel of Asia world, the highway, ports, and buildings that symbolize a nation's aspiration for development. On the other, the ruined lives, the addiction-scarred communities, and the ongoing conflict in the ethnic borderland, where the drug trade he institutionalized continues to fund violence and despair. This is the haunting paradox of Lo Hsing Han, the builder and the destroyer, the peace broker whose wealth was sown in the fields of war, the philanthropist whose generosity was funded by a global epidemic of suffering. He crafted a perverse form of immortality, ensuring his name would endure not merely in the annals of crime, but in the daily functioning of a nation. In the very roads its people travel and the buildings in which they work, his life asks of us difficult, lingering questions about the nature of justice in an imperfect world, about the complicity of global systems, and about the seductive power of narratives that whitewash horrific pasts in the name of present utility. It warns us that evil, when it is ambitious and intelligent enough, does not always wear a monstrous face. It can wear the face of a quiet, disciplined businessman, a benefactor of temples, a partner to generals, a father concerned with legacy. It reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are not those who rage against the system, but those who patiently, cunningly become the system. As the final chapter of his earthly tale closes, we are left not with a sense of resolution, but with a chilling awareness of unfinished business. The empire he built adapts and persists. The shadows he cast are long, stretching from the poppy fields of the Golden Triangle to the corporate towers of Yangon, and into the countless lives across the world forever altered by the heroin that bore his invisible stamp. The Godfather of Heroin is gone, but the world he helped shape remains, a testament to the enduring, corrosive power of his dark ambition. If this deep dive into the shadowy, real-world saga of Lo Hsing Han held your attention, if it made you think about the complex web where crime and power intersect, then you cannot miss our other explorations into the hidden histories that shape our world. We have meticulously researched stories of other infamous kingpins, unexplained geopolitical mysteries, and the untold narratives of figures who operated from the shadows. Your engagement fuels this journey into truth, so take a second now to ensure you never miss a story. Smash the like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel for your regular path into the world's most gripping untold histories. And click the notification bell so you're always the first to know when we drop a new video. The story of Lo Hsing Han is over, but the search for understanding continues. Join us in the next video as we unravel another meticulously researched chapter from the annals of power, crime, and consequence. Until then, stay curious.